So I'm going to cover some things about marine mammals today. And what I've done is I've picked out the most obvious species because we have a huge number of marine mammals here in Oregon, but we don't get to see the vast majority of them. So I'm going to concentrate on the ones that you are likely to see and want to know something about. But I will also mention that you don't have to remember everything. We're going to be one of the doses. You don't have to know everything because you get these really good handouts that, when someone asks you about something, you can just, sort of like, oh, you did know that, that you can share to them. So don't feel like you don't remember everything. So I'm going to start with the most obvious ones that we see on the beach, the pinnipeds. And we have 4 of them in Oregon. We have 2 seals and 2 sea lions. We occasionally get these odd ones that come, but we're not going to worry about odd ones today. We're just going to look at the things that you are most likely to see in abundance. And we're going to concentrate on the coast, although you can see seals and sea lions in the estuaries. But we're going to look at the fact that here in Oregon, we have lots of places where you see these pinnipeds, these seals and sea lions. And we're exceedingly fortunate that we have a National Wildlife Refuge, the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. And these seals and sea lions use these rocks, these reefs, these islands to come out onto land. And that's why we can see them, which is really an amazing thing. There's places in Oregon that we can see thousands of them. People go to Africa, to the Serengeti to see thousands of something or others, but we can just drive up to Cape Arago, get out of our car, and sometimes see 1,000. We haven't spent $10 million to get there. And these offshore islands, these reefs, these rocks are incredibly important areas for resting and breeding for these pinnipeds. They have to come to land to rest and to breed. And that's, of course, why we can see them. So we're going to start on looking at the seals. Their scientific name, they're the phocids. We have 2 of them, the harbor seals, the elephant seal. And the characteristics of all seals is they can swim with their hind flippers. That's how they propel themselves. So they have a hind flipper that is kind of like a fan. They have 2 of them. So you can do this. You can show your visitors this if you get yourself organized. And they move from side to side, close, open. Years of practice has got this going. And that's how they swim. They are known as the ear of a seal. They don't have ear flap like we do. That's a characteristic for them. And they can't pull their hind flippers underneath their body. So they're like worms on land. They're just flat. They can't turn their hind flippers under. So when you see them moving on land, they move kind of like an inchworm does. They all have a similar annual cycle to their life. So we see them here in Oregon all year, on and off. Sometimes there's more on land than others. So if we start with when they give birth, they have to come to land to give birth. Can't give birth in the water. The female then nurses the pup, but all the phocids, all the seals have very short birth to weaning periods. It's on the average of the 2 that we have here, 3 to 4 weeks. Sometimes the seals in the Arctic, it's 3 to 4 days. So the female and the pup don't have a lot of time together. Once weaning has happened, the pup becomes independent of the female. So those little pups you see down in Bandon, they will nurse for 3 or 4 weeks, and then they're on their own. And they go off and they'll become, they'll feed out in the water. So it's a very short period. After weaning occurs, the female becomes receptive again. Mating occurs, depends on the species, on land and water, just before or just after weaning, depending on the species. And then they have a long non-breeding. The rest of the year is a non-breeding time where they go out to forage in the ocean, but they also come back onto land for periods of rest And sometimes during that time, they go through a molt. And the molt is different depending, and we'll see that in a moment, depending on the species. So that's the annual cycle of these fossils, of these seals. So let's look first at the harbor seal, the one that is most common to us. Harbor hemisphere species, you find them on the East Coast, you find them in Europe, and our Pacific population is pretty large. There's quite a lot of them. We have about 10,000 of them here in Oregon. And the population is pretty stable. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife does surveys for them on somewhat, not every year, but on a somewhat regular basis. And it appears that the population is now at a level where it's maintaining itself through birth and death. They live about 30 years, and you cannot tell males from females. They're the same size. So you can't keep saying, oh, look at him out there. Okay? There could be a fur out there as well. There's no difference in size. They are very common up at Cape Arago. I mean, you have them here, but you don't have, Bandon doesn't have a large population. We have about 1,000 of them in the Coos Bay area, some in the estuaries, but most of them out of the Cape Arago and North Cove. And if you've been there, we were very fortunate about 20 years ago during the harbor pupping season, to close the trail down to the beach. And that has meant that the harbor seals now feel much more secure. And instead of where they used to putt on the offshore reef areas, they now putt very close to the beach area, in the area I've circled in pink there. And that means you can go to Cape Arago in April, late April, and you can actually see harbor seals reborn. It's really pretty exciting because they now no longer are sort of interrupted by people being on the beach. They give birth anywhere between 2 to 5 years of age. They have one pup a year. And one of the exciting things to go watch them there, if you go up there, is that the bald eagles come and eat the afterbirth, the placentas. And it's really exciting to, it's a wildlife spectacular. It's really an exciting place. And as I said, the pups are nursed on land, and in the water. The pups can swim almost at birth. And that makes sense, because if you look at that area at Cape Arago, what happens when the tide is high? It is covered up. So these animals have to be able to swim at birth, and they can. And then they're weaned after 3 to 4 weeks. We don't know much about their mating because it does not occur on land. They mate in the water. We think sometime in the summer, June and July. And it looks like what happens is males hang out in places and they defend underwater territory. So they stop other males from coming. They make, at this time, the males make sound. The only times you hear harbor seals making sound is either during the breeding, during birth, the birth and to weaning period, where the females and the pups make sounds to each other, and you'll hear that kind of, I can't do it, but it's kind of a little whining sound. And then the males make sounds, but we don't hear it because it's an underwater sound. We can only hear it when we record it on hydrophones. And it looks like they defend underwater territories from other males, and the sounds probably also are used to attract females. But you'll notice when we study marine mammals, we always know way more about what happens on land than we do in the ocean, because it's much harder to study those areas. They feed often at dark in the evenings, and they use these amazing bristles. So underneath that picture underneath is a microscope of their bristles, and you can see it's kind of bumpy. And what they're doing is they are following the vibrations that in the water, the movement of the water, that the fish here at the top makes when it does its tail back and forth. So those bristles are really important for the animal for finding its food. Occasionally, we know that there are blind harbor seals that are perfectly healthy, so they're using that movement of the water to find their food. What do they eat? Depending on who you meet at North Cove, they'll think they eat nothing but salmon, but that is not correct. They are incredibly diverse in their diet. But they eat a lot of flatfish. All those red things on that list are some kind of flatfishes. How do we know this? Well, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, I don't know if any of you have met Susan Rima. She's a longtime person who works for ODFW, and she has spent her career looking at different marine mammal fecal material, because all fish have a little ear bone that is species size specific. So you can take these, what we call the scat of a harbor seal. You can go out onto a hole out and find it. You can rinse it and you can pull out the hard parts, and you can get those ear bones, and you can say that is an English sole. So we know a lot about what these pinnipeds eat. And now Susan actually is even better than that. She can look at like some of the bones of the fish, and she knows that that is a fish bone from that fish. She's an amazing person to be able to tell that. But you can see how diverse their diet is. So that's the harbor seals. Northern elephant seals are the other seal that we see here. They're a totally different beast. There's about 15,000 of them in the Pacific. That's the only place we find them. There's a southern elephant seal, but they're Pacific. And the difference with these is the males are much larger than the females. And that is an evolutionary response to their social systems. So, and they are different in that they breed in the winter. The males return in December to the wherever they are, and the vast majority of them are in Mexico and California. We have a small population that uses the North Cove, Shell Island, and Cape Arago, but it's really tiny, and it's a marginal population, as we'll see. But the males return, and they set a dominance hierarchy. In other words, they fight each other, they use sound, they use size and physical strength to exclude the vast majority of males. Only about 5% of the males in elephant seals ever actually end up breeding. 95% of them are just too weak, too marginal. They just don't ever get to do anything. So this is an extreme form of sexual dimorphism that is so the bigger you are, the better you are, the better you will do. Once they've got the dominant hierarchy, females will return, and you'll get a group of females, and this male will be over here, and he'll be stopping all the other males from getting in, and it's like total chaos. And they return, and they again, like all the pinnipeds, give birth to a single pup. And again, they nurse, but in this case, they have the pup cannot swim at birth, so they have to be on land. So they have to be somewhere where that there's a place where they can get out of the ocean. And they nurse for about 4 weeks, and they go from being that really skinny thing that you see there at the top to being that thing at the bottom. Whoops. There. Then, so after 4 weeks, mating occurs on land. The male mates with the female, and then the female leaves. She's just spent a month on land feeding this pup, taking all of her fat resources, turning it into milk, and she needs to go to sea to feed. But the pup remains on the beach. He or she is a fat blob of fat. They need to turn into muscle And so they lie there and there's a lot of weird metabolism that goes on, and then they start to do little swims, and then finally they will go, and they'll stay on the beach for maybe 6 weeks, maybe 7 weeks, sometimes, just depends on the animal. So that's why Cape Arago is not a good place to come. I mean, what happens in the winter up there? You know, we get massive storms, and we don't have anywhere for them to get out of the water for when we have storms. So most years we don't see any success. We've had a couple of years where the weather has been such that we've had a few pups maybe survive, but they're always going to be marginal. We know from the colonies in California that when a pup goes to sea, 50% of them never come back. And it's probably going to be way more for these guys because they have had marginal success because of the weather. They've had to swim earlier, the mothers probably left earlier, and so it fluctuates. You sometimes see a few animals out there, but once we get one big winter storm, it's a disaster. I kind of think of these as the ones that come to Cape Arago. They are the losers of the north of the elephant seal world, and they're being selected out of the population. They're not passing on any genetic material. What do they do when they leave? Well, they go out into the open ocean. You do not see an elephant seal if you're out salmon fishing or out fishing anywhere hardly. And these are just tracks of where different animals go. The red is our males. They tend to go north up to the Aleutian Islands to feed. And the yellow is females, and they tend to go further out into the open ocean to feed. And we're getting more and more information. If you're interested in learning more about elephant seals, the folks at UC Santa Cruz, the Army Nuevo elephant seal population are well studied. There's tons of information about them. What do they do when they're out there? These are amazing animals. We know this now from instrumenting them. Their average depth is 1,500 feet. They can go a mile deep in the ocean. They hold their breath on average for about 24 minutes. But they can hold their breath for an hour and a half if they need to. They only come to the surface for a couple of minutes at a time, and then they dive back down again. That picture at the top is an example of the dive statistics that you can see. They don't spend much time on the surface. So no wonder we never see them. These animals live underneath the water. They don't live on the surface when they're out to sea. And of course, they have remarkable physiological ability to do that. They shut down their blood supplies, their heart rate falls, and we know lots more about them than we used to. So here's an example of sort of the timing of when you might see elephant seals in Oregon on the beach, because we do see some of them during the non-breeding season. So here, this is a male. He leaves after breeding in March. If he's been lucky, he's one of the 5%. He goes up to the Aleutians. He spends a couple of 6 weeks or so there feeding, and then lo and behold, he turns around and he swims back to where he came on the beach before. Why does he do this? He returns to molt, and he does what's called a drastic molt, kind of like altitude. So that entire layer of skin and hair gets molted off. It takes about 3 to 4 weeks. This is when we tend to see elephant seals on the beach, and they just lie on the beach, and people think they're dead or dying, and the stranding network gets calls about these things. Because look at that top thing; doesn't it look like it's got problems? Well, it's a very healthy seal, but it's just molting. And so this is in the spring. This is March, April. And then he leaves again after molting, and he goes back pretty much to the same space after the Aleutians, gets there around September or so, couple of months feeding, and then he comes all the way back to the breeding grounds in December to either breed, or if he's not lucky, just to hang out. And it's a massive, distance that they travel. So, and the females do the same thing, except the females go out to sea, and they molt at different times. So this is when you're going to see elephant seals. If we're lucky, we see some during the breeding season, and as starting in December because it's the winter. Then we see that if we're lucky, we might see a few pups, but not very often these days. What we do see is they see them in spring when they come back to molt. And molting is different at different times. The little ones, the females and the juveniles tend to be first and so on, and the adult males are last. And then we get this kind of October, November period where sometimes we'll see them at Cape Arago where they're juveniles and young of the year, sometimes sub-adult, where they just come and they just haul out for reasons no one really knows. They just come out and hang out for a while. Maybe they fed enough, who knows? They just need to rest, who knows? So those are elephant seals. Now let's move on to the other pinnipeds, the sea lions. They look different. And one reason they look different is they have the ability to pull their hind legs underneath their bodies. And so their feet rest on the ground, unlike the harbor seals where their feet are straight up behind them. And that means that despite, it would be kind of like you walking with your pants around your ankles, but you could do it, you can move. And that means that they can use different areas of land. They're more capable of moving, climbing. They're capable of getting out on docks, for example. We see that in Charleston and Newport, and lots of different places. They swim, not with their hind flippers, but with their fore flippers, much like a bird, up and down. And, if you go to the Oregon Coast Aquarium, you can actually see this happening, which is always one of those good aquarium things. And they're known as the eared seals because they have an external ear flap. The harbor seals and the elephant seals have ears, they can hear. It's just they don't have a piece sticking out the side like the sea lions. Their scientific name is the Odorides. And they have strong sexual dimorphism. So they're like the elephant seals in that a single male, the large animal there, will have a group of females that he defends, or actually he defends his space. So he will come to the breeding grounds, he'll have his space, and he'll have a territory. And if another male, and then the females will come, and they will choose a good male, good space, somewhere where their babies are not going to get washed off the rock or something. And then he will defend other males coming to his territory. And again, evolutionary, that has created really strong sexual dimorphism. And males get to be huge, they fight, they roar, they do make sounds to say, hey, I'm the biggest boy on the rock, don't come near me. They have a very different cycle to the phocids, much longer. So they again have to come to give birth on land. The female will nurse her pup on land for a short period. Her milk is much less rich than that of the seals. The seal's milk is something like 50 to 60% fat. We're used to 4%. These animals, the sea lions, more like in the 10 to 20. And she'll nurse her pup, and then she'll leave her pup to go back to feed, to replenish her stores. She'll go to the ocean. That goes on for a long time. Depends on the species, 4 months, up to 12 months, and in some cases even longer. So there's a lot more connection between the female and the pup in these animals. In the seals, the female and the pup, 4 weeks, and you may have noticed the male has nothing to do with them in both species. The male is just there to impregnate the female, and that's it. So those books you see in the library for kids with families of seals doesn't have that. She'll return to feed her pup, And sometimes in that, when the male is still on the colony, so not long after she's given birth, it just depends on the species, mating will occur on land in this case. And so she'll be feeding a pup, and then she'll also be pregnant. And if she's going to have a 1 year cycle, some will not necessarily get pregnant straight away. It just depends on the health of the female. As the pup grows, she will take the pup to sea to feed. They'll come back to land again, but she'll still continue to nurse. And then weaning will occur, as I say, depending on the species, anywhere 4 to 12, sometimes longer months, and then the cycle will start again. So there's a lot more female pup bond in these sea lions than in the seals. We have 2 species here in Oregon that we will see. The California sea lion, as its name implies, is much more common, breeds in California. There's quite a large population, 350,000 individuals, we think, at the moment. The population comes and goes, the numbers come and go. The population is mostly controlled by disease, which is the case for all of these pinnipeds. Disease is really the thing that controls their population. So we get outbreaks of leptospirosis, for example, in California sea lions, which we'll do a number of them in. They're susceptible to harmful algal blooms, and so on. They tend to be a darker animal than the Steller or the northern sea lion. And as its name implies, the northern sea lion or the Steller sea lion is found in more northern areas. It occurs here in Oregon. It goes down into central California, but occurs all the way up through the Aleutian Islands. They tend to be lighter in color, and they're actually, the males are bigger than the California sea lions. So when you see a very large sea lion, you know it's a Steller sea lion. And there's about 12,000 of them, we think, in Oregon. Both species occur at Simpson's Reef year-round. It used to be the case when I first started at OIMB. You never saw California sea lions during the summer, but we now see them year-round. California sea lions don't breed there. The vast majority of them are males. Because of that long pup dependency with females, the females stay further south. They stay in California. We may get a few females. We can't, we don't set every California sea lion that crosses the border. But the vast majority of them are male. And this is the sea lion that makes the barking sound, the R sound that you hear out there. They are here, they hole out here to rest, they feed here, and then during the breeding season, most of them go back to California, but of late, some of them just stay around. And it's probably the younger animals that are never going to get to breed anyhow, but they're still young, and it's like, why go all that way if you're going to be beaten up by some bigger animal? Just wait and grow. Steller sea lions, we see out Cape Arago, we see both females and we see males. And of late, we have been seeing a few pups, 1 or 2 pups. So they are giving birth there, but only a couple. In Oregon, the places where you find them are the Rogue River Reef, the Orford Reef, and some of the islands to the north of us here. There's a few places where they breed, but the vast majority of them are breed in southern Oregon. So I'm now going to move on to cetaceans. I'll give it a chance at the end if the people have questions, but I think I'll move to the whales and cover those yet, because I think we're in good shape for timing. So 2 kinds of cetaceans or whales. There's the mysticetes, these are the ones with the baleen, and then there's the odontocetes, and these are the ones with the teeth. And if you get a chance to look really close, the mysticetes have 2 blowholes, their nose. The odontocetes have just 1 blowhole for their nose. So I'm going to talk mostly about grey whales because grey whales are what you're going to see when you stand on the cliff and you look out to sea. They're the most common animals because they come close to shore. The vast majority of other cetaceans, we're just, you know, if you stand on the cliff, we're just not going to see. We're not going to see um, some. We'll look at a couple more that we might see, but these are the most common there. They are sort of an average size baleen whale. They weigh a huge amount. And they're this mottled color. There's their baleen. Their baleen hangs from the roof of their mouth, and that's what they use to capture their food. And this is a structure that is made from the same thing as our hair or our nails. It's keratin. And it is like our nails and our hair. It can grow continuously. And that makes sense because the friction of the water, the friction of the tongue wears it away, and so it's able to replace itself. There, it's just these series of plates on both sides, and of course, so they can close their mouth, it gets shorter at the back and shorter at the front. The baleen in the baleen whales varies in size and color, and it's very dependent on what the animal eats. If it eats bigger things, it's coarser. If it eats finer things, or smaller things, it's much finer. Gray whales are modeled because they are the most parasitized animal that I know. They grow all over their bodies. The vast majority are barnacles. Not the same kind of barnacles that you see on the rocks in Bandon. These are specific gray whale barnacles. Their life cycle is totally adapted to the life cycle of the gray whale. We'll see that the gray whales migrate to breed of Mexico, and that's where the barnacles breed too. So once that baby gray whale is born, there are little barnacle larvae in that water just ready to go on and become a gray whale barnacle. Amongst the barnacles are these what's known as whale lice. They aren't lice, they are an amphipod, which is like one of those bee choppers that you see. I mean, it obviously looks differently, but it belongs to that group. And they are not permanently attached. They can move around on the skin. And it's thought that they feed on the dead skin of the whale. And some they've got these little hooks that hold on to the skin there. So that's what makes the mottling of these animals. And then you get where the barnacles have died and fallen off, you get those white spot patches. So these animals are really mottled. They exhale, they have a blow, and their blow is kind of a bushy blow. And blows are really helpful for telling you what kind of whale it is. The size, the sort of the shape. And so the gray whale blow is not, you can kind of see how big it is there. It's not huge, but and it's not really kind of narrow. It's sort of this bushy blow. So they are another one of those animals that has an amazing migration. The vast majority of them feed in the summer up in the Chukchi and Bering Seas off of Alaska. And then come, November-ish, they leave when that area, the ice comes in, they leave and they head south. So we see them on their way south, December, January, as they're headed down to the lagoons in Baja, California. That's where they go to the warm water to give birth. And that's where, of course, the males go to the warm water because the females are there, and that's where mating will occur. Come February, we'll start to see them. So about now, we should start to see them moving back north, headed back up to their feeding area. Pretty much during this entire migration, they do not feed. They have like many of the mysticetes, the baleen whales, they have a feeding a time where they feed a huge amount and then they don't feed. So it's not just the grey whales that do that. It's very common for most of the baleen whales. It's a feast and famine kind of deal. Right now, the northern migration is taking place, and it tends to be in somewhat of an order. The young animals will leave the lagoons first. They might not actually even go to the lagoons. You know, they'll come on the migration and like, well, I need to feed. I'm going to turn around and go back again. Females that have got pregnant but don't have calves, they will, why hang around? They went to the lagoons to get pregnant because that's where the males were, and then they will start. Then the males, they'll have done their job, they'll leave, and then the females with calves will be last because they are the ones, the calves are slower to swim, and they'll need to, they take longer. Now, not all grey whales go to Alaska. We have a small group known as the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, about 200 whales that have a different kind of life strategy. They hang around from middle central California up into Canada during the summer. They just don't go. And I want to talk about this, but I'll talk about those in a moment. But here's just a sort of schematic of how their social system or their breeding system works. A migration south, a pregnant female, migration north, she feeds, she migrates again, she gives birth, she migrates north with her calf, she feeds in the summer, she weans her calf up in the Arctic, she starts again, and so on. So they have a 2-year cycle. Not that all of them get pregnant every 2 years, as we'll see in a moment for numbers. Here's that grey whale Pacific Coast Feeding Group. So those of you who've seen whales in June or July, August, September, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at these animals that decide not to go to the Arctic. It's both sexes, about 200, 250 of them. They tend to be slightly smaller animals, interestingly enough. And some of them show really strong sight fidelity. And because there's so few of them, we've been able to, or I haven't, but different people have been able to actually identify them through some natural markings. They'll have scars from those barnacles. There's one that obviously had some kind of entanglement issue and has got a really big scar, And so people who've looked at these animals and taken lots of photos of them have been able to see them, and some of them, they've even given them names for different places. Depot Bay is a place where they've done a lot of work on this, and some of those animals come back year after year. And then we've been looking at them long enough now that some of those animals come back, females come back year after year, and they bring their calves back to that area. So there's a maternal inheritance of that high sight fidelity. Not all of the animals are like that. I mean, some residence times, they're just there one day. Port Orford's another place where sometimes you can see a lot of animals. Other times you don't see any. So it just depends. And of course, they are going where there's food. And they're feeding on, when they go to the Arctic, they are pretty much benthic feeders, meaning they feed on the bottom. And that's because the Arctic ice grows this algae underneath it. It's called an ice algae. And that algae dies, it falls to the bottom, and it feeds a whole carpet of mud-dwelling amphipods, tube-dwelling, like beach hopper things that live there. And the whale goes down, turns on its side, and scoops up a huge amount of sediment with all of these tube-dwelling amphipods. The sediment goes out through the baleen, and then they get to eat the amphipods. We don't have those two dwelling arthropods here. And what we've learned is, and again, we've done this where people go out behind the whales and they wait for them to poop with a little net and they suck it up and then they bring it back under the microscope for the bits. And we know that they eat a variety of small things, a group of like shrimp-like animals called mysids that are very common in the kelp beds. Porcelain crab larvae, little crabs. Sometimes there's huge amounts of these larvae that come in, and also amphipods. But we also know that some of them, depending on where they are, will scoop up things that live in the sediment too. We don't see that so much here. That's more up in Washington, where they appear to have a different group of organisms living in the sediments. So they're pretty shallow feeders. Which is why we see them close to shore when they're feeding. They're often feeding in the kelp beds, they're often feeding out in open waters. It just depends on where the food is. So that's why some years at Cape Arago, we'll see gray whales pretty much every summer, but then there's other years, I don't look it up these days, but some of you guys do. You don't see them. It's like, I didn't see a gray whale last summer, people will tell me. And it's like, well, you weren't in the right place, So this is a very unusual. We're learning more and more about these animals. They're well studied by a group at Oregon State. Oregon State has an incredible group of marine mammal biologists. They are sort of the premier place in the nation now for marine mammal biology. And they have a researcher who has been looking at those gray whales down in Port Orford for the last few years. So we're learning quite a lot about them. And so they also have a good website about marine mammals, so that's another good place to go look for information. So one of the things that's happened though with gray whales is the numbers are really falling. That's another reason we're not seeing so many of them. This is the gray whale abundance and the calf projection from 94 to 2022. And you can see they have varied. They're a high of about 26,000 in 2016 to only about 13,000 now. And the number of calves that are born have really, really fallen. And only in 2025, they count gray whales off of a point in Southern California, and they've got it down. They do infrared stuff, they do drone stuff, so they're pretty good at numbers. And they only on the northern migration, they only saw 85 mother calf pairs. So the numbers are really falling, and we don't really know why. There was certainly we had this that UME. I don't know what UME stands for. It means lots of them are dying, and they were skinny. They were probably starving, and one reason is that the ice in the Arctic is melting. There's in September 2024. There's you can see the amount of average ice is really going down, and that's because when you get less ice, you get less algae, you get less alcohol. The food resource isn't there. It's pretty sort of straightforward how it works, and so our numbers of gray whales are really reduced. Now, these animals have made a comeback. They were almost extinct, so they have the capability to move to sort of have a variety of population sizes. But it'll be interesting to think about how it's going to be interesting to see how well they do and whether we get more in the Pacific Coast population. We just don't know. We did not have a Pacific Coast feeding group probably 20, 30 years ago. So who knows? So to finish up on the mysticetes, the baleen whales, what else will you see off of Oregon? Well, more and more we are seeing from land. I mean, if you go out in the boat, you'll see these for sure in the summer. But more and more we're seeing humpback whales for land, and the reason is there's just more of them. And humpback whales are relatively easy to spot if you see one, and they're just not. They're just moving and going somewhere. It's more difficult, but if they're hanging around feeding, they're you'll see their flippers sticking out the water, you'll see their tails, and we know a lot about these animals, again, because of their unique markings. The tail is different, the back often is different, and so on. So it's worth looking out for these. I've seen these from Cape Arago. In the last few years, they're becoming much more common to see because there's more of them. And they are Pacific, they're worldwide. They're both in the northern and southern hemisphere. And we get humpback whales in Oregon from a whole host of populations. We get the Central American ones, we get the ones from Mexico, and we probably get some from the Hawaiian Islands. And those circles are where they breed. So we see them during the non-breeding season when they are feeding. So that's why they come here, because our coast is, our coastal ocean is rich because of the upwelling that we get that produces the algae, the plankton, and the small fish that they eat. And of late, we've been seeing more blue whales, even from land. These are big animals. You cannot miss them. And we're seeing them because the numbers of blue whales off the Pacific coast, the California coast, down into Mexico and towards Costa Rica is increasing. You know, we whaled them, but they're making a comeback. And so people have reported them from looking at Cape Arago. I've actually seen one down off of Port Orford Heads. And you cannot mistake them when you see them. The blow is huge. It's this massive sort of towering thing. It's like, you know, you could mistake it. We obviously get fin whales here as well. I don't know how how you tell the difference between them without seeing them, you know, up close. But blue whales are the more common ones. We know we get fin whales because we had one dead on the beach not long ago. So worth keeping an eye out for these guys. They're again coming to feed, and so when there's big concentrations, you know, of food in an area, that's where you see the blue whales. That's where you see the humpback whales. If there's not a good concentration of food, and food is patchy. Sometimes it's off of Cape Arago, sometimes it's south of here, of Blanca, sometimes it's up on Stonewall Bank. You know, just it's a patchy thing. So that's where the food is where you're going to see these animals. And just to show you, they move around a lot. We've got about 3,000 of them on the Pacific West Coast. And these are just individual tagged blue whales. And you can see they move around all over the place. So again, as I say, it's just luck. And as I would tell my students, the more you go out, the more you're going to see. So to finish up, let's talk about the toothed whales, the odontocete. And I'm going to focus primarily on killer whales, orcas, because those are the ones you're most likely to see off of Oregon. And they are distinctive animals. You cannot mistake them from anything. They've got the black and white markings, and they have very tall dorsal fins. Males much larger than females. So when you see a really tall one like that, you know you'll see the male. We're learning a lot more about killer whales through tagging them again. And we've now realized that we have essentially 4 different ecotypes. And not that we don't think they're species, although there's some debate on this. We know most about what we call the residents. These are the ones that are most commonly seen in the Straits of Guadalupe, in Salish Sea, and up into British Columbia. And as their name implies, they are resident mostly in that area. And because of that, we know lots about them. We know a little bit more about the bigs, or what used to be called the transients. These are ones that occur along the coast. They come and go. They probably go from Southeast Alaska down to Northern California, but they tend to be coastal. They occasionally come into the estuaries. These are the ones that we most commonly see here in Oregon, although the residents will make excursions down to Monterey now and again. We've learned that through tagging, and so we might see a resident You and I would have a hard time telling them apart, but they are distinct. They have distinct markings. We know, for example, we know every single resident. They're super well known because of their markings. We know quite a few of the transients because of their markings. There's a group that are the offshores. As their name implies, they are offshore, so we don't see them very often. And we've now learned there's a group that is even more offshore than the offshores, and they've been termed the oceanic. And we know nothing about those guys, but they aren't offshore. I don't know. Who knows? We're going to find out more. And why there are differences. There are differences, obviously, as I said, in their distributions, but there's differences in their social structures. There's difference in how they look, their morphology, and the size, like the shape of their dorsal fins, the markings, the black and white markings. There are differences in what they eat, and there's differences in the sounds they make. So, for example, if you're a mammal eater, like if you eat seals, sea lions, and other whales, you don't want to make a lot of noise and say, hey, I'm coming, I'm coming, I'm coming. Whereas if you're a fish eater, then it doesn't matter if you make a lot of noise, because you make a noise at a frequency that fish can't hear, and you can then tell your conspecific, hey, fish are over here, come on, come and get them. So there's sense, there's a reason why vocalizations would differ. So here's some of the differences that we know about them. So the residents are really an amazing group of animals. There are two communities. There's one in the northern part of British Columbia, and then a southern resident that comes more down into Washington State. The amazing thing about these is that they have family groupings. It's a matrilineal society where there's a female and all of her offspring, including the males, stay together as a grouping. That is very unusual in the mammal world. Normally males leave when they become sexually mature. And that's so they stay together in these groupings. So we know all about them. If you've looked at any of the websites, you can talk about J-pod, L-pod, and K-pod, and they know tons of them. They're fish eaters, primarily salmon, primarily Chinook salmon. They're highly, as I say, highly vocal, and they spend the vast majority of their time in those areas, although they do come to the open ocean during the winter, apparently. The transients are big. They have a slightly different social system. The males leave the family grouping when they become a certain size. So you will see big males as individuals. So sometimes we see just one male come into or two males together sometimes. I've seen them come into Coos Bay to chase the harbor seals, and they tend to come in about this time, March, April, May, because the harbor seals are pupping, and the females are really fat, and they're really good to eat, because these are marine mammal eaters. But they eat all kinds of marine mammals. They will eat. Some of you have probably seen those TV programs where they're attacking gray whales in Monterey Bay, or blue whales places. And they're primarily marine mammals, but I think they also do eat maybe some squid, but there's a little evidence for that. And of course, they're much less vocal. They don't want the marine mammals to know they're coming. We don't know about the social system of the offshores because we don't know much about them, but we do know that they eat sharks and large fish. And we know that because of finding dead ones on the beach, but also in those animals, their teeth wear down because sharks have a very hard skin, and so their teeth essentially go down to the gum line, just like an elephant, and that's probably why they die. They run up, they get old, and they run up, they can't eat anymore. So we do know that. And we do know that these oceanic ones, because I think people have seen them, attack marine mammals and turtles. But that's about all we know about them. So Those are the orcas. And then finally, there are two other toothed whales that you might see. If you go out to you won't see these from land, but if any of you go fishing offshore, not far offshore, you'll occasionally run into Dall's porpoises. And these are very fast moving animals. If you're moving in the boat, they love to come up and ride the bow. And they're that black and white, and we occasionally get a dead one on the beach, and people think they're baby killer whales, but they're not. They're Dall's porpoises. And if you see, has anyone seen them at sea? Oh, they're really fun to watch, ride the bow. And then finally, our most common toothed whale is one that hardly anyone sees unless it's a really black, calm day. It's the harbor porpoise. This is a little animal about this big, and its dorsal fin is about this big. So the chances of seeing it, you've got to have a really fun day. But you do see them at Cape Arago now and again. I mean, that's a picture from Cape Arago, and it's like, that's what you see. They don't jump out the water, they don't do anything spectacular, they're just out there eating fish. They occur in groupings. We've got quite a few of them. They're just little hard porpoises. So, and then finally, I'm just going to mention, I know some of you had Kyle talk about sea otters last in February, but just in case you weren't here, I'll just go briefly on talk about sea otters. As we know, they've been hunted out of Oregon and Washington and most places, and because of the they have. Their historical range there is from Japan down to Mexico. The current range is where you see them is in yellow, and they occur in the southern group in California, a northern group through the Aleutian Islands. They've been reestablished populations brought from the northern Aleutian Islands in Washington and British Columbia. So we do, but we don't have them here in Oregon. And just briefly, if you have otters, you have a much more diverse subtidal, coastal subtidal in habitat. You get a lot more kelp, you get a lot more different invertebrates, none of which dominate, and you get a real complex habitat that really is good for fish. If you don't have otters, you get less kelp because the urchins dominate and eat the kelp, and the habitat is not as complex. So it's good to have otters. And we're working hard in Oregon to get otters back through a group called the Alaka Alliance. Alaka is the Chinook Native American word for sea otters. If you don't know much about it, the website is very extensive, and they send out a really good thing called the Raft every month or so that tells you what Alaka Alliance is doing to try and get sea otters back to Oregon. And they're working super hard to do this, and they're making a lot of progress. And they just got a very large award from the World Conservation Fund, I think it is. And they also, the Select tribe just got a large grant from the US government to work on this. So stay tuned, things are moving with Alaka Alliance. And finally, just to remind people that marine mammals are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which for our purposes essentially says you cannot harass a marine mammal, which means that you can't do anything like touch it or move it or make it change its behavior, which is why you pup watchers are really good to be in Bandon, and thank you very much, because it, and the same at Cape Arago, because it saves the marine biology station do horrible things like move them around and leave them on the beach. But one should also remember that not every harbor seal pup is going to survive. I mean, there's a reason why our population is stable. Some die, and we should not make people think that we're going to, make that every harbor seal is going to be supported and live. And if you find a live or dead stranded marine mammal, we have a stranding hotline, and that's the information for the stranding hotline. They have a webpage. Oregon State runs it. Jim Rice is the stranding coordinator, and he deals with dead and live things on the beach. And with that, I think I am done. Yeah, so if you have questions, I'd be more than pleased to answer the questions. Thank you very much.
I was just wondering, since the offshore feeding gray whales that stay around, they've adapted to feed that way, is it possible that the ones that are starving from lack of ice will adapt as well?
Yeah, gray whales are very adaptable for what they feed on. And so, yeah, but the problem is up there, there's nothing else but these arthropods. So, yeah, so it's not, it'll be interesting to see, does the benthic community up there change in a way that different species will move north into that benthic community? Yeah, I don't know enough about the benthic community in Alaska to know if that's even possible. But yeah, it's certainly possible that they've obviously adapted to different things on the Oregon coast and in Washington and British Columbia. They eat ghost shrimp up in British Columbia because there's a lot of ghost shrimp that apparently grow in that's offshore there. And so yeah, so there's hope. Yeah.
You say the gray whales feed in the kelp beds. Do they ingest any of that kelp when they're feeding?
No, because they're filtering. I mean, you see, if you watch them, you actually see the kelp kind of drape over their bodies, but and often the mysids they'll be in the kelp, and if the kelp is thick, it's hard for the whales to get through, but there'll be mysid swarms around on the outside of the kelp. When mysids are in numbers, there's huge numbers of them.
Is this good orcas do not attack people like divers and surfers, or are they attacking?
Yeah, there's no known human interaction in the wild. It's only been, the only people that have been harmed have been in the captive situation.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Nice to know it's still true.
Yeah. Don't worry about being eaten by one.
How much do these whales eat?
Oh, good question.
Huh?
Lots.
Yeah.
I mean, they when they're in a good patch of food, they just feed continuously. These mysticetes particularly, because they don't feed for 6 months of the year, so they're just constantly feeding. I mean, I'm not good on those kind of numbers, but I'm sure that there's some estimates there. You know, a 50-ton gray whale probably eats, I don't know how much. But, you know.
So they scoop up the mud and everything on the ocean
Yeah.
floor, and that gets
Yeah.
filtered through the.
Yeah, and so in places where they do that, we don't see that here because they don't, or I've not seen it here. They don't appear to be the bottom feeders so much here, but I've seen it up in off of Washington, and you can see the mud trail behind, or the sediment trail that comes out of them. They're just, and up in the Arctic, there are pits that have been formed, and those pits cause disturbance, and then different organisms actually will colonize those pits early on before they get recolonized by the tube dwelling arthropods. So the gray whales are an important benthic structuring organism in the Arctic, and that they make for patchiness, and patchiness is always very good. Well, thank you very much. That was fun.